On reaching Watling Street, Leonard and his companion found Dr. Hodges was from home. This did not much surprise the apprentice, after the information he had received from Solomon Eagle, but Thirlby was greatly disappointed, and eagerly questioned the porter as to the probable time of his master's return. The man replied that it was quite uncertain, adding, "He has been in since you were last here, and has seen Blaise." He had not been gone to the cathedral many minutes when a gentleman arrived, desiring his instant attendance upon a young woman who was sick of the plague. "Did you hear her name?" asked Leonard and Thirlby, in a breath. "No," replied the porter, "neither did I obtain any information respecting her from the gentleman, who appeared in great distress. But I observed that my master, on his return, looked much surprised at seeing him, and treated him with a sort of cold respect." "Was the gentleman young or old?" demanded Leonard, hastily. "As far as I noticed," replied the porter, "for he kept his face covered with a handkerchief, I should say he was young, very young." "You are sure it was not Lord Rochester?" pursued Leonard. "How should I be sure of it?" rejoined the porter, "since I have never seen his lordship that I am aware of. But I will tell you all that happened, and you can judge for yourselves. My master, as I have just said, on seeing the stranger, looked surprised and angry, and bowing gravely, conducted him to his study, taking care to close the door after him. I did not, of course, hear what passed, but the interview was brief enough, and the gentleman, issuing forth, said, as he quitted the room, 'You will not fail to come?' To which my master replied, 'Certainly not, on the terms I have mentioned.' With this, the gentleman hurried out of the house. Shortly afterwards the doctor came out, and said to me, 'I am going to attend a young woman who was sick of the plague, and may be absent for some time. If Mr. Thirlby or Leonard Holt should call, detain them till my return.' My heart tells me that the young woman he is gone to visit is no other than Amabel," said Leonard Holt, sorrowfully. "I suspect it is Nizza Mackescree," cried Thirlby. "Which way did your master take?" "I did not observe," replied the porter, "but he told me he should cross London Bridge." "I will go into Southwark in quest of him," said Thirlby. "Every moment is of consequence now." "You had better stay where you are," replied the old porter. "It is the surest way to meet with him." Thirlby, however, was too full of anxiety to listen to reason, and his impatience producing a corresponding effect upon Leonard, though from a different motive, they set forth together. "If I fail to find him, you may expect me back ere long," were Thirlby's last words to the porter. Hurrying along Watling Street, and taking the first turning on the right, he descended to Thames Street, and made the best of his way towards the bridge. Leonard followed him closely, and they pursued their rapid course in silence. By the time they reached the north gate of the bridge, Leonard found his strength failing him, and halting at one of the openings between the tall houses overlooking the river, where there was a wooden bench for the accommodation of passengers, he sank upon it, and begged Thirlby to go on, saying he would return to Watling Street as soon as he recovered from his exhaustion. Thirlby did not attempt to dissuade him from his purpose, but instantly disappeared. The night, it has before been remarked, was singularly beautiful. It was almost as light as day, for the full harvest moon, alas! There was no harvest for it to smile upon, having just risen, revealed every object with perfect distinctness. The bench on which Leonard was seated lay on the right side of the bridge, and commanded a magnificent reach of the river, that flowed beneath like a sheet of molten silver. The apprentice gazed along its banks, and noticed the tall spectral-looking houses on the right, until his eye finally settled on the massive fabric of St. Paul's, the roof and towers of which rose high above the lesser structures. His meditations were suddenly interrupted by the opening of a window in the house near him, while a loud splash in the water told that a body had been thrown into it. He turned away with a shudder, and at the same moment perceived a watchman, with a halberd upon his shoulder, advancing slowly towards him from the Southwark side of the bridge. Pausing as he drew near the apprentice, the watchman compassionately inquired whether he was sick, and being answered in the negative, was about to pass on, when Leonard, fancying he recognized his voice, stopped him. "We have met somewhere before, friend," he said, "though where, or under what circumstances, I cannot at this moment call to mind." "Not unlikely," returned the other, roughly, "but the chances are against our meeting again." Leonard heaved a sigh at this remark. "I now recollect where I met you, friend," he remarked. "It was at St. Paul's, when I was in search of my master's daughter, who had been carried off by the Earl of Rochester. But you were then in the garb of a smith." "I recollect the circumstance, too, now you remind me of it," replied the other. "Your name is Leonard Holt as surely as mine is Robert Rainbird. I recollect, also, that you offended me about a dog belonging to the piper's pretty daughter, Nizza Macascree, which I was about to destroy in obedience to the Lord Mayor's commands. However, I bear no malice, and if I did, this is not a time to rip up old quarrels." "You are right, friend," returned Leonard. "The few of us left ought to be in charity with each other." "Truly, ought we," rejoined Rainbird. "For my own part, I have seen so much misery within the last few weeks, that my disposition is wholly changed. I was obliged to abandon my old occupation of a smith, because my master died of the plague, and there was no one else to employ me. I have therefore served as a watchman, and in 20 days have stood at the doors of more than 20 houses. It would freeze your blood were I to relate the scenes I have witnessed." "It might have done formerly," replied Leonard, "but my feelings are as much changed as your own. I have had the plague twice myself." "Then, indeed, you can speak," replied Rainbird. "Thank God, I have hitherto escaped it. Ah! These are terrible times, terrible times. The worst that ever London knew. Although I have been hitherto miraculously preserved myself, I am firmly persuaded no one will escape." "I am almost inclined to agree with you," replied Leonard. "For the last week the distemper has raged fearfully, indeed," said Rainbird, "but yesterday and today have far exceeded all that have gone before. The distempered have died quicker than cattle of the murrain. I visited upwards of 100 houses in the borough this morning, and only found 10 persons alive, and out of those 10, not one, I will venture to say, is alive now. It will, in truth, be a mercy if they are gone. There were distracted mothers raving over their children, a young husband lamenting his wife, 2 little children weeping over their dead parents, with none to attend them, none to feed them, an old man mourning over his son cut off in his prime. In short, misery and distress in their worst form, the streets ringing with shrieks and groans, and the numbers of dead so great that it was impossible to carry them off. You remember Solomon Eagle's prophecy?" "Perfectly," replied Leonard, "and I lament to see its fulfillment. The streets shall be covered with grass, and the living shall not be able to bury their dead, so it ran," said Rainbird. "And it has come to pass. Not a carriage of any description, save the dead cart, is to be seen in the broadest streets of London, which are now as green as the fields without her walls, and as silent as the grave itself. Terrible times, as I said before, terrible times. The dead are rotting in heaps in the courts, in the alleys, in the very houses, and no one to remove them. What will be the end of it all? What will become of this great city?" "It is not difficult to foresee what will become of it," replied Leonard, "unless it pleases the Lord to stay his vengeful arm. And something whispers in my ear that we are now at the worst. The scourge cannot exceed its present violence without working our ruin, and deeply as we have sinned, little as we repent, I cannot bring myself to believe that God will sweep his people entirely from the face of the earth." "I dare not hope otherwise," rejoined Rainbird, "though I would fain do so. I discern no symptoms of abatement of the distemper, but, on the contrary, an evident increase of malignity, and such is the opinion of all I have spoken with on the subject. Chales told me he buried 200 more yesterday than he had ever done before, and yet he did not carry a third of the dead to the plague pit. He is a strange fellow, that Chowless. But for his passion for his horrible calling there is no necessity for him to follow it, for he is now one of the richest men in London. He must have amassed his riches by robbery, then, remarked Leonard. True, returned Rainbird. He helps himself without scruple to the clothes, goods, and other property of all who die of the pestilence, and after ransacking their houses, conveys his plunder in the dead cart to his own dwelling. In St. Paul's? Asked Leonard. No, a large house in Nicholas Lane, once belonging to a wealthy merchant, who perished, with his family, of the plague, replied Rainbird. He has filled it from cellar to garret with the spoil he has obtained. And how has he preserved it? Inquired the apprentice. The plague has preserved it for him, replied Rainbird. The few authorities who now act have, perhaps, no knowledge of his proceedings, or if they have not cared to interfere, awaiting a more favorable season, if it should ever arrive, to dispossess him of his hoard, and punish him for his delinquencies, while, in the meantime, they are glad, on any terms, to avail themselves of his services as a burier. Other people do not care to meddle with him, and the most daring robber would be afraid to touch infected money or clothes. If you are going towards Nicholas Lane, said Leonard, as if struck with a sudden idea, and will point out to me the house in question, you will do me a favor. Rainbird nodded assent, and they walked on together towards Fish Street Hill. Ascending it, and turning off on the right, they entered Grady's Cheap, but had not proceeded far when they were obliged to turn back, the street being literally choked up with a pile of carcasses deposited there by the burier's assistants. Shaping their course along Grassetchett Street, they turned off into Lombard Street, and as Leonard gazed at the goldsmiths' houses on either side, which were all shut up, with the fatal red cross on the doors, he could not help remarking to his companion, the plague has not spared any of these on account of their riches. True, replied the other, and of the thousands who used formerly to throng this street not one is left. What to London, wah. Leonard echoed the sentiment, and fell into a melancholy train of reflection. It has been more than once remarked that the particular day now under consideration was the one in which the plague exercised its fiercest dominion over the city, and though at first its decline was as imperceptible as the gradual diminution of the day after the longest has passed, yet still the alteration began. On that day, as if death had known that his power was to be speedily arrested, he sharpened his fellest arrows, and discharged them with unerring aim. To pursue the course of the destroyer from house to house, to show with what unrelenting fury he assailed his victims, to describe their sufferings, to number the dead left within their beds, thrown into the streets, or conveyed to the plague pits, would be to present a narrative as painful as revolting. On this terrible night it was as hot as if it had been the middle of June. No air was stirring, and the silence was so profound, that a slight noise was audible at a great distance. Hushed in the seemingly placid repose lay the great city, while hundreds of its inhabitants were groaning in agony, or breathing their last sigh. On reaching the upper end of Nicholas Lane, Rainbird stood still for a moment, and pointed out a large house on the right, just below the old church dedicated to the saint from which the thoroughfare took its name. They were about to proceed towards it, when the smith again paused, and called Leonard's attention to two figures quickly advancing from the lower end of the street. As the apprentice and his companion stood in the shade, they could not be seen, while the two persons, being in the moonlight, were fully revealed. One of them, it was easy to perceive, was Chowless. He stopped before the door of his dwelling and unfastened it, and while he was thus occupied, the other person turned his face so as to catch the full radiance of the moon, disclosing the features of Sir Paul Paravison. Before Leonard recovered from the surprise into which he was thrown by this unexpected discovery, they had entered the house. He then hurried forward, but, to his great disappointment, found the door locked. Anxious to get into the house without alarming those who had preceded him, he glanced at the windows, but the shutters were closed and strongly barred. While hesitating what to do, Rainbird came up, and guessing his wishes, told him there was a door at the back of the house by which he might probably gain admittance. Accordingly they hastened down a passage skirting the churchyard, which brought them to a narrow alley lying between Nicholas Lane and Abchurch Lane. Tracking it for about 20 yards, Rainbird paused before a small yard door, and trying the latch, found it yielded to his touch. Crossing the yard, they came to another door. It was locked, and though they could have easily burst it open, they preferred having recourse to an adjoining window, the shutter of which, being carelessly fastened, was removed without noise or difficulty. In another moment they gained a small dark room on the ground floor, whence they issued into a passage, where, to their great joy, they found a lighted lantern placed on a chair. Leonard hastily possessed himself of it, and was about to enter a room on the left when his companion arrested him. "Before we proceed further," he said in a low voice, "I must know what you are about to do?" "My purpose will be explained in a word," replied the apprentice in the same tone. "I suspect that Nizimakaskree is confined here by Sir Paul Paravison in Chowles, and if it turns out I am right in my conjecture, I propose to liberate her. Will you help me?" "Humph," exclaimed Rainbird, "I don't much fancy the job. However, since I am here, I'll not go back. I am curious to see the coffin-maker's hoards. Look at yon heap of clothes. There are velvet doublets and silken hosen out of furnished wardrobes for a dozen court gallants. And yet, rich as the stuffs are, I would not put the best of them on for all the wealth of London." "Nor I," replied Leonard. "I shall make free, however, with a sword," he added, selecting one from the heap. "I may need a weapon." "I require nothing more than my halberd," observed the smith, "and I would advise you to throw away that velvet scabbard, it is a certain harbor for infection." Leonard did not neglect the caution, and pushing open the door, they entered a large room which resembled an upholsterer's shop, being literally crammed with chairs, tables, cabinets, movable cupboards, bedsteads, curtains, and hangings, all of the richest description. "What I heard is true," observed Rainbird, gazing around in astonishment. "Chowles must have carried off everything he could lay hands upon. What can he do with all that furniture?" "What the miser does with his store," replied Leonard, "feast his eyes with it, but never use it." They then proceeded to the next room. It was crowded with books, looking-glasses, and pictures, many of them originally of great value, but greatly damaged by the careless manner in which they were piled one upon another. A third apartment was filled with flasks of wine, with casks probably containing spirits, and boxes, the contents of which they did not pause to examine. A fourth contained male and female habiliments, spread out like the dresses in a theatrical wardrobe. Most of these garments were of the gayest and costliest description, and of the latest fashion, and Leonard sighed as he looked upon them, and thought of the fate of those they had so lately adorned. "There is contagion enough in those clothes to infect a whole city," said Rainbird, who regarded them with different feelings. "I have half a mind to set fire to them." "It were a good deed to do so," returned Leonard, "but it must not be done now. Let us go upstairs. These are the only rooms below." Accordingly, they ascended the staircase, and entered chamber after chamber, all of which were as full of spoil as those they had just visited, but they could find no one, nor was there any symptom that the house was tenanted. They next stood still within the gallery, and listened intently for some sound to reveal those they sought, but all was still and silent as the grave. "We cannot be mistaken," observed Leonard. "It is clear this house is the receptacle for Charles's plunder. Besides, we should not have found the lantern burning if they had gone forth again. No, they must be hidden somewhere, and I will not quit the place till I find them." Their search, however, was fruitless. They mounted to the garrets, opened every door, and glanced into every corner. Still, no one was to be seen. "I begin to think Nizik cannot be here," said the apprentice, "but I am resolved not to depart without questioning Chowles on the subject." "You must find him first," rejoined Rainbird. If he is anywhere, he must be in the cellar, for we have been into every room in this part of the house. For my own part, I think you had better abandon the search altogether. No good will come of it." Leonard, however, was not to be dissuaded, and they went downstairs. A short flight of stone steps brought them to a spacious kitchen, but it was quite empty, and seemed to have been long disused. They then peeped into the scullery adjoining, and were about to retrace their steps, when Rainbird plucked Leonard's sleeve to call attention to a gleam of light issuing from a door which stood partly ajar, in a long narrow passage leading apparently to the cellars. "They are there," he said, in a whisper. "So I see," replied Leonard, in the same tone. And raising his finger to his lips in token of silence, he stole forward on the points of his feet and cautiously opened the door. At the further end of the cellar, for such it was, knelt Challis, examining with greedy eyes the contents of a large chest, which, from the hasty glance that Leonard caught of it, appeared to be filled with gold and silver plate. A link stuck against the wall threw a strong light over the scene, and showed that the coffin-maker was alone. As Leonard advanced, the sound of his footsteps caught Charles's ear, and uttering a cry of surprise and alarm, he let fall the lid of the chest, and sprang to his feet. "What do you want?" he cried, looking uneasily round, as if in search of some weapon. "Are you come to rob me?" "No," replied Leonard, "neither are we come to reclaim the plunder you have taken from others. We are come in search of Nizza Macaskri." "Then you have come on a fool's errand," replied Challis, regaining his courage, "for she is not here. I know nothing of her." "That is false," replied Leonard. "You have just conducted Sir Paul Paravicin to her." This assertion on the part of the apprentice, which he thought himself justified under the circumstances in making, produced a strong effect on Challis. He appeared startled and confounded. "What right have you to play the spy upon me thus?" he faltered. "The right that every honest man possesses to check the designs of the wicked," replied Leonard. "You admit she is here. Lead me to her hiding place without more ado." "If you know where it is," rejoined Challis, who now perceived the trick that had been practiced upon him, "you will not want me to conduct you to it. Neither Nizza nor Sir Paul Paravicin are here." "That is false, prevaricating scoundrel," cried Leonard. "My companion and I saw you enter the house with your profligate employer. And as we gained admittance a few minutes after you, it is certain no one can have left it. Lead me to Nizza's retreat instantly, or I will cut your throat." And seizing Challis by the collar, he held the point of his sword to his breast. "Use no violence," cried Challis, struggling to free himself, "and I will take you wherever you please. This way, this way." And he motioned as if he would take them upstairs. "Do not think to mislead me, villain," cried Leonard, tightening his grasp. "We have searched every room in the upper part of the house, and though we have discovered the whole of your ill-gotten hoards, we have found nothing else. No one is there." "Well, then," rejoined Challis, "since the truth must out, Sir Paul is in the next house. But it is his own abode. I have nothing to do with it, nothing whatever. He is accountable for his own actions, and you will be accountable to him if you intrude upon his privacy. Release me, and I swear to conduct you to him. But you will take the consequences of your rashness upon yourself. I only go upon compulsion." "I am ready to take any consequences," replied Leonard, resolutely. "Come along, then," said Challis, pointing down the passage. "You mean us no mischief," cried Leonard, suspiciously. "If you do, the attempt will cost you your life." Challis made no answer, but moved along the passage as quickly as Leonard, who kept fast hold of him and walked by his side, would permit. Presently they reached a door, which neither the apprentice nor Rainbird had observed before, and which admitted them into an extensive vault, with a short staircase at the further end, communicating with a passage that Leonard did not require to be informed was in another house. Here Challis paused. "I think it right to warn you you are running into a danger from which ere long you will be glad to draw back, young man," he said, to the apprentice. "As a friend, I advise you to proceed no further in the matter." "Waste no more time in talking," cried Leonard, fiercely, and forcing him forward as he spoke. "Where is Nisa? Lead me to her without an instant's delay." "A wilful man must have his way," returned Challis, hurrying up the main staircase. "It is not my fault if any harm befalls you." They had just gained the landing when a door on the right was suddenly thrown open, and Sir Paul Paravicin stood before them. He looked surprised and startled at the sight of the apprentice, and angrily demanded his business. "I am come for Nisa Macascree," replied Leonard, "whom you and Challis have detained against her will." Paravicin glanced sternly and inquiringly at the coffin-maker. "I have protested to him that she is not here, Sir Paul," said the latter, "but he will not believe me, and has compelled me, by threats of taking my life, to bring him and his companion to you." "Then take them back again," rejoined Paravicin, turning haughtily upon his heel. "That answer will not suffice, Sir Paul," cried Leonard. "I will not depart without her." "How?" exclaimed the knight, drawing his sword. "Do you dare to intrude upon my presence? Begone! Or I will punish your presumption." And he prepared to attack the apprentice. "Advance a footstep," rejoined Leonard, who had never relinquished his grasp of Challis, "and I pass my sword through this man's body." "Speak, villain," he continued, in a tone so formidable that the coffin-maker shook with apprehension. "Is she here or not?" Challis gazed from him to the knight, whose deportment was equally menacing and appeared bewildered with terror. "It is needless," said Leonard, "your looks answer for you. She is." Yes, I confess she is," replied Challis. "You hear what he says, Sir Paul," remarked Leonard. "His fears would make him assert anything," rejoined Paravicin, disdainfully. "If you do not depart instantly, I will drive you forth." "Sir Paul Paravicin," rejoined Leonard, in an authoritative tone, "I command you in the king's name, to deliver up this girl." Paravicin laughed scornfully. "The king has no authority here," he said. "Pardon me, Sir Paul," rejoined Challis, who began to be seriously alarmed at his own situation, and eagerly grasped at the opportunity that offered of extricating himself from it. "Pardon me. If it is the king's pleasure she should be removed, it materially alters the case, and I can be no party to her detention." "Both you and your employer will incur His Majesty's severest displeasure by detaining her after this notice," remarked Leonard. "Before I listen to the young man's request, let him declare that it is his intention to deliver her up to the king," rejoined Paravicin, coldly. "It is my intention to deliver her up to one who has the best right to take charge of her," returned Leonard. "You mean her father," sneered Paravicin. "Aye, but not the person you suppose to be her father," replied Leonard. "An important discovery has been made respecting her parentage." "Indeed," exclaimed Paravicin, with a look of surprise. "Who has the honor to be her father?" "A gentleman named Thirlby," replied Leonard. "What?" cried Paravicin, starting, and turning pale. "Did you say Thirlby?" The apprentice reiterated his assertion. Paravicin uttered a deep groan, and pressed his hand forcibly against his brow for some moments, during which the apprentice watched him narrowly. He then controlled himself by a powerful effort, and returned his sword to its scabbard. "Come into this room, young man," he said to the apprentice, "and let your companion remain outside with Challis."
Fear nothing. I intend you no injury.
I do not distrust you, replied Leonard, and if I did, should have no apprehension. And motioning Rainbird to remain where he was, he entered the room with the knight, who instantly closed the door. Paravicent's first proceeding was to question him as to his reasons for supposing Nizza to be Thulbe's daughter, and clearly perceiving the deep interest his interrogator took in the matter, and the favorable change that, from some unknown cause, had been wrought in his sentiments, the apprentice did not think fit to hide anything from him. Paravicent's agitation increased as he listened to the recital, and at last, overcome by emotion, he sank into a chair, and covered his face with his hands. Recovering himself in a short time, he arose, and began to pace the chamber to and fro. "What I have told you seems to have disturbed you, Sir Paul," remarked Leonard.
"May I ask the cause of your agitation?"
"No, man, you may not," replied Paravicent, angrily. And then suddenly checking himself, he added, with forced calmness, "And so you parted with Mr. Thirlby on London Bridge, and you think he will return to Dr. Hodges's residence in Watling Street?"